One, that Mr. Carney was not upfront or honest with Canadians during the election. He made numerous false statements he would have known were false when he made them. Two, there is a cornucopia of conflicts of interest in these investments, like we have never seen before from a Canadian Prime Minister.
Pierre Poilievre makes a statement on Mark Carney's clear and obvious omission of the truth when he was talking to the reporters on the campaign trail about his conflicts of interest, which are great and numerous. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. Pierre Poilievre came out to address Mark Carney's conflict of interests. And I'm going to be talking less about the conflict of interest and more about the way that the media responded to it and how Pierre Poilievre, true to form, maintained his grace and spoke to the issues that they wanted to talk to him about, because that's what they're trying to do right now, right? They're not asking Mark Carney tough questions, just like that, right? We all of a sudden we hear that there's 100 and some odd conflict of interest. We further hear the scandal of this is that Mark Carney said one thing and the truth is another thing, but we don't see the corporate media going after them. We don't see any independent media having microphones in front of these very people. So now we are talking about a very elite group that is in charge of these media organizations, right? That are in charge of this so-called union that they only allow certain groups into. Then they only allow they only get so much of them get access to the Prime Minister, which makes him a Prime Minister not of Canada, but a Prime Minister of only people that agree with him. But that's a different video. This one I want to point out how it's the corporate level people, it's the board of directors, it's the director of this. These are the people that are telling these reporters what to say. Now, I get that many of the reporters are happy to say it, but that's not what I'm trying to get you to hear. What I want you to hear is that it's coming from on high, and these people have Mark Carney's number in their phone. They can text him. And of course, rather than chase down the scandal, which is what's best for Canadians, rather than have that Watergate moment that they all dreamt about when they were journalists in journalist school before they became the propaganda brokers that they are now. Nonetheless, Pierre Poilievre still tried to address the concern. Pierre Poilievre still tried to address the 100% inaccuracies and the idea that there is a way around it for Mark Carney that at least will alleviate some of the concerns of Canadians like myself, which we are now, we're near 50% of the country that is talking the opposite side of the line. And we know that the media is worried about it because they were saying nothing about Trump. And now all of a sudden, that's all we can hear. Trump, 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 because they want to distract you from the inconsistencies of the conflict of interest. And they're not even asking Mark Carney to explain himself, which is, the final proof in the pudding.
So Conservatives are calling for two things today. One, we call on the Prime Minister to come before you and explain the contradiction. How is it that he was telling Canadians that he only had real estate and cash when he knowingly had stock options and other deferred benefits? How is it that he claimed he didn't know it was in his blind trust when we now learn that he knew exactly what was in that trust? And how is it that he said that he had no financial interest in Brookfield when he knew exactly that he had stock options and deferred share units? We're calling on the Prime Minister to sell his investments, turn them into cash, hand them to a trustee who can invest them in a way that is completely blind to him, so that he does not have any knowledge of what he owns.
I believe Mark Carney should explain himself. And we hear Pierre Poilievre be reasonable and say, well, that's what a blind trust really is. The thing is that Mark Carney had indicated that he had already sold everything off and all he had left was cash and real estate. He said he sold off all of his stock options. He sold everything and turned it into cash, and then that was in a blind trust. We now know that that is not accurate. Now, if you're out there and you're telling yourself that you don't care that he's this kind of conflict because you think for some reason it's not going to impact you, that's very naive. Or if you're telling yourself you're willing to take that hit because you think it's going to harm Donald Trump, that's beyond naive into foolish. And if you think that it's okay because you carry the same political stripe as that person, then you're just as guilty as he is. Where in your mind do you think that these rich elite people are going to care what happens to you once they get from you what they need? You should be more upset about it than anybody. It's the people who voted for Mark Carney that should be marching up and down everywhere screaming that he explained himself. Because that's what's required. And then the suggestion that he sell everything and turn it into cash, well, that's what he said he had done anyway. Now, personally, I don't think that him not saying anything about it is a good look. I believe that that is guilt by omission. I believe that what he doesn't say is actually proof that what he did or what he's being accused of is accurate. Of course, people who are watching the mainstream media are trying to convince themselves that Mark Carney is somehow not this person that is just riddled with conflicts of interest and quite willing to hide those conflicts of interest to get your vote. And I guess that's something that they should look at themselves over. But, of course, the mainstream media came out right away and started to talk to Pierre Poilievre, not so much about what he was announcing and what he was requesting for Mark Carney. No. They came out and asked him about what he thinks the Indigenous contribution to Bill C-5 should be. And does he support them going on a summer of protests?
That C-5's far from a solution. It's better than nothing, but not by much. The logic, there's a very big flawed logic in the approach the Liberals are taking. First of all, they've put in terrible laws that block development. C-69, the anti-development law, C-48, the ban on offshore shipping, the emissions cap, the industrial carbon tax. And then they've acknowledged that those laws are terrible, so they've passed another law to go around those terrible laws for select projects. This may allow some projects to go ahead. Some is better than none, and that's why we agreed to vote for it. We wanted the possibility that something, anything, could get built in this country, which is not possible under the bad laws the Liberals put in place to begin with. So I don't want anybody to think for a second that we think C-5 is a solution. The real solution is to get rid of C-69, C-48, the emissions cap, the industrial carbon tax, and many more of these other terrible Liberal policies. Then and only then will the hundreds or even thousands of projects that need to go ahead have a free market in which to do so. Now here we are in this strange situation where the Prime Minister has to select these projects to go ahead. Obviously, the best way forward is to win First Nations buy-in. And what I would say is the best way to do that is to ensure that First Peoples benefit from the projects. We had a policy during the election campaign, which I continue to support, which allow businesses to divert a share of their federal corporate tax to the local local First Nations on whose lands the projects go ahead. This would be own source revenue for First Nations to build schools, hospitals, clean drinking water systems, job training, you name it. And they wouldn't have to go back to Ottawa to ask for money from federal bureaucrats. It would come directly to them. Because I forgot to mention it, you think of someone like Ellis Ross, who was the first counselor, the chief counselor of the Haisla First Nation. He helped put together the LNG Canada deal in Northwest British Columbia that has a terminus at Kitimat, $40 billion. This is the biggest project in the history of Canada, ever. There's never been a $40 billion project. And that doesn't include the pipeline component, which is another 5 or 10 billion. And his people will benefit for many generations as a result of that. Let's take that model, let's spread it right across the country, and let's make our First Nations and all Canadians have the chance to become the most prosperous on earth.
Well, crickets from the mainstream media over whether or not Mark Carney is going to be doing that and how Pierre Poilievre feels that he should be. No expounding on the question at all. Instead, they want to pivot to Bill C-5. They want to try and see if Pierre Poilievre agrees with the First Nations people going rioting. Pierre Poilievre, true to form, responds with the truth. He feels that C-5 is not a good bill, but he supported it because it was better than nothing. And I mean, that's basically all we get from the Liberal government. If you look at the history of the Liberal government in this country, it's always just a little bit better than nothing. It's never groundbreaking. It's never, brings anything to fruition. There's always more problems. They're always chasing their tail, and they always leave Canada holding the bag. Of course, he did mention MP Ellis, who negotiated the largest deal in Canadian history, $40 billion, without including the actual pipeline, and how we can be doing the same thing for all of the bands across this country, how they should just be looped in. And that's something that we as a culture should understand. Now, I get that there's a little bit of friction there one way and then the other way, and I don't want to dive too far into that, though I'm versed in it. I just think that the best way to solve the problems, to get these things taken care of, is to cut them in, is to give everybody a piece of the check, give them some jobs. You know, like, I'm not saying that they're all going to get $1 billion check every month or whatever it may be, but certainly you can say, here's the percentage that is a fair royalty. In addition, how many of you can do this job? You know, you're in. You know what I mean? Like, here's 10 jobs that you can have while generational wealth we're talking about. I mean, we don't put these things in so that they turn off in a couple of weeks. These are jobs that are there winter, fall, through high school, through college, through university. Kids can come in. I mean, these are generational jobs. And these generational jobs are needed not only in the First Nations, but in the whole country. But when you start to give those kind of paychecks and that stability to people that are working in poor regions of the country, they start to enrich the poor regions of the country. So now the wealth begins to spread out. Now the wealth begins to move away from all of the major cities and up into the northern part of the country, which many of you that are regular viewers of the Canadian Shield know that I believe that's something that Canada needs to be doing. Because once the wealth goes, once we build it, people will come. Along with that will come teachers. Along with that will come doctors. And we will, eventually have this look of a country where we're not just crammed along the border. And then when Donald Trump says, I don't want to pay for, or someone in America says, you're not allowed to trade with us, we can say, oh, well, we're fine. We're trading amongst ourselves. Everything is hunky-dory. The setup that we have now is no good. And Mark Carney's desire to make it all about a bureaucracy in Ottawa is also no good. Mark Carney thinking that he should have the final say, no good. But it's better than nothing.
Well, I disagree with separation. I'm a Canadian patriot. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and I understand the frustration. I still think that there's no other country in the world where someone of my modest origins would be able to make it to this place. And that's the story that millions of people have lived and relived from across the country. So we are united by that Canadian promise. But as I say, and I say it here and I've been saying for years, we have to put a final end to this notion that Ottawa tells Alberta to pay up and shut up. And that's what Albertans have been told by this Liberal government for a decade. Their frustrations are entirely legitimate. Alberta is the #1 net contributor, per capita contributor to Confederation, paying more in tax than getting back in federal programs. The major industry of Alberta has been under relentless attack for the last 10 years. The rural and Western way of life is under attack with ridiculous gun bans, all while allowing repeat offenders to go and terrorize communities, including rural communities where crime is now, for the first time in a generation, a serious danger in communities where people didn't even have to lock their doors. So I say all of that to point out that the frustration is real and it is legitimate, and we should neither dismiss it nor deride the people who hold those frustrations. It's the job of all federal leaders and frankly all members of Parliament to redress the very unfair treatment that Western Canada has been receiving.
We know that all of the mainstream media is put together, so we know that they share questions and they share answers, right? So when they couldn't get a rise out of them over the First Nations and the First Nations saying that they might have a summer of rioting and all the rest of that, or protesting, or whatever the word happens to be, they switched now over to Alberta separation, which of course is not what they're making it out to be. It's, as I've done a video on, Alberta separation is just a perfect storm of 3 or 4 things happening all at the same time. Of course, there would be no talk of separation if the people in Alberta were not treated so poorly. There would be no discussion if they were treated the same way they were treated in Quebec. There would be no problem at all, except for they're not treated. And what bothers me the most is these people at the top, these corporations, these directors of the board who think that they can direct the propaganda to say a message when it's certain groups of people. Well, we have to give them a voice, right? We have to change the entire way we do things because they need a voice. They're tired of being ignored. They're tired, and all of that may be valid. But now when it's laid to the people who are not liberals, mostly, and to the people who have a product of fossil fuels, all of a sudden they don't get a voice? All of a sudden, these rules of equity and equality and all these things that you hear the far left espouse doesn't apply to everyone? It only applies to people that you think of. Now, how in your mind is that any different than what you're complaining against? Right? How in your mind is you telling yourself that because I'm on this side of the fence, only people on my side of the fence do I agree with? How is that different than, say, the individual who says he doesn't believe in female autonomy or he doesn't believe in same-sex marriage or any of that stuff? How is that different? I'll tell you, it's not different. It's exactly the same. You're not being any better than the people that you're claiming to be against. You are, however, alienating the entire province of Alberta, the single largest per capita payer of taxes into the big kitty, which of course is why the corporations are all of a sudden losing their minds, right? Because they're like, oh, no, we don't get a lot of money out of Quebec. We give all of our money to Quebec so they'll vote for us. But if Alberta goes and Saskatchewan goes along with them, Manitoba, Yukon, they might join in as well. Well, there goes all the wealth that they have access to, and they're losing their minds over it. So they turn up the propaganda, and they get people who spend half of their year in Florida or Arizona to cast votes for them, leaving the rest of us in the lurch, leaving the rest of us to worry about what we're going to be doing. And the mainstream media says nothing about the conflict of interest and says nothing about these obvious inabilities to solve the problem, the trade barrier. We hear them talking about how the new deadline is August the 1st. No, it is not August the 1st. The new deadline of August the 1st is that we have to get the border under control or the tariffs go to 30%. Of course, the mainstream media doesn't want anybody to be focusing about any of that. So they come at Pierre Poilievre talking about C5 when he's not sitting in the House. And they then switch over to Alberta separation because, he's now in a riding in Alberta. But he's from there, and he said what he had to say, and they didn't like the answer because there was no pushback. He just thinks that Alberta has the right to be upset. I sit here in the center, and I tell you right now that if there were anybody in the left, anybody in that press gallery being treated this way, they would be screaming to the high heaven about how they're feeling marginalized and victimized and everything, all the other words that go along with that. What has to happen here is the Liberal Party has to put down their what the only word we can call it, their hatred of all things Alberta, and start to govern the country as a whole instead of telling themselves that they're going to be more worried about what some people say than what other people say, because that's not equality, that's not democracy, that's not any of those things. That's just my opinion. You can let me know what your opinion is down in the comments. I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.